In the early years of the 20th century, Vienna was a city where anti-Semitism was part of the public discourse. In cafés, newspapers, and election campaigns, Jews were pointed out as a threat to the nation, the economy, and cultural identity. A young man named Adolf Hitler lived there, he observed, and took notes. He did not rise to power with an improvised idea. For years, he absorbed and reorganized various forms of hatred, religious, racial, and economic. When Germany fell into crisis after World War I, he found in this enemy a useful response to explain the defeat, chaos, and hunger. Anti-Semitism stopped being propaganda. It became a power structure. Where did Hitler's hatred of Jews truly begin? How did an idea become the core of the Nazi state? Where hatred was born, the Vienna that shaped Hitler. In the early years of the 20th century, Vienna stood as one of the nerve centers of Europe, a metropolis of contrasts where modernity and tradition converged. Under the rule of the Habsburg dynasty, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire housed a mix of nationalities, cultures, and languages. This diversity, far from creating an integrated society, fueled ethnic tensions and resentments that manifested at all social levels. In this cultural melting pot, Adolf Hitler arrived in 1907, an 18-year-old provincial with artistic aspirations and no solid academic training. The young Hitler did not arrive in Vienna as a fully formed anti-Semite. His prejudices, which would later crystallize into an absolute hatred, were gradually forged through contact with the ideological currents that dominated Vienna's political and cultural life at that time. Vienna in 1907 was an environment where anti-Semitism flourished in many forms. The Jewish community, which represented about 10% of the population, had reached visible positions in economic, cultural, and intellectual life, fueling resentments among the impoverished middle class. The young Hitler would absorb and synthesize these various currents. Traditional Christian anti-Semitism, which saw Jews as the deicide people. Modern anti-Semitism based on pseudoscientific grounds that classified them as a racially inferior race. And economic anti-Semitism, which blamed them for both capitalist crises and, paradoxically, the socialist threat. Karl Lueger, mayor of Vienna from 1897 to 1910, represented for Hitler a model of how anti-Semitism could become an effective political tool. Lueger, leader of the Christian Social Party, had transformed anti-Jewish prejudice into a successful electoral platform, combining urban modernization policies with a rhetoric that blamed Jews for social ills. The young Hitler watched in fascination as Lueger mobilized the masses through a charismatic discourse that blended anti-Semitism, Catholicism, and populism. But Lueger's influence was not the only one. Georg von Schönerer's pan-Germanism, with its emphasis on racial purity and visceral rejection of the Jews, also had a profound impact on Hitler. While Lueger represented a pragmatic anti-Semitism, useful for winning elections, Schönerer embodied a radical anti-Semitism, almost religious in its fervor. Hitler would absorb elements from both, combining political pragmatism with racial intransigence. Hitler's personal experience in Vienna was decisive. Rejected twice by the Academy of Fine Arts, he lived years of extreme poverty, barely surviving in shelters for homeless men. This social descent coincided with his increasing exposure to low-quality anti-Semitic literature, racist pamphlets, and conspiracy theories that circulated abundantly in Vienna's cafés and boarding houses. In the shelters where he sought refuge, Hitler came into contact for the first time with Orthodox Jews from Eastern Europe, with their traditional clothing and long beards, which reinforced his perception of the Jew as a foreign element to the German national body. The Viennese years transformed Hitler. His anti-Semitism, initially diffuse, solidified into a coherent, albeit delusional, worldview, where the Jew was not merely an economic rival or a distinct religious group, but an existential threat to Aryan civilization. This view combined disparate elements: medieval prejudices, modern racial theories, social Darwinism, and personal resentment. What was peculiar about the anti-Semitism Hitler developed in Vienna was its totalizing nature. It was not limited to criticizing specific aspects of Jewish culture or religion. It built a complete explanation of history and society where the Jew functioned as a universal explanatory principle. For Hitler in 1913, when he left Vienna for Munich, the Jew was no longer just a cultural or religious other. He was the absolute antagonist, the metaphysical enemy of the Aryan race. This ideological metamorphosis took place far from the public spotlight. At that time, Hitler was nothing more than one among thousands of failed young men, with no clear prospects, absorbing conspiracy theories on the margins of a society in crisis. But the seeds planted in those years would germinate decades later when that directionless young man would find himself in a position to turn his personal obsessions into state policy. The betrayal that ignited the fire, Germany after the defeat. On November 11, 1918, when the last shots were fired on the Western Front, Germany faced an incomprehensible reality for many of its citizens: defeat. Although German territory had never been militarily occupied, material exhaustion, the collapse of its allies, and the entry of the United States into the conflict made the continuation of the war unsustainable. For a population fed for years on triumphalist propaganda, capitulation was inexplicable. Hitler, like millions of German veterans, lived the armistice as a betrayal. The war experience had been a revelation for him. The front had provided, for the first time, a sense of belonging and purpose. The war, with its organized violence and logic of annihilation, became his mental model to understand all social relationships. The defeat not only demolished the imperial order, but threatened to strip the meaning of those 4 years of sacrifice. In this context, the stab-in-the-back myth, Dolchstoßlegende, emerged, one of the most pernicious and lasting ideological constructions in modern German history. According to this narrative, promoted by generals like Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by civilians in the rear: socialists, pacifists, Republicans, and above all, Jews. The stab-in-the-back theory provided a comforting explanation for a painful reality. Instead of accepting the defeat as the result of strategic mistakes, Allied material superiority, or economic exhaustion, it pointed to an internal enemy. For a traumatized nation, this story offered two psychological advantages. It preserved military honor and channeled frustration toward achievable targets within its own borders. German Jews became the main target of this narrative of betrayal. Nationalist propaganda depicted them as instigators of strikes during the war, pacifists who undermined fighting morale, speculators who enriched themselves from the people's hunger, and Bolsheviks promoting revolution. This view conveniently ignored that 100,000 Jews had served in the Imperial Army, 12,000 had died in combat, and many had received decorations for their bravery. The November Revolution of 1918, which led to the Weimar Republic, intensified anti-Semitic tensions. Although it was largely led by German Social Democrats, the visible presence of some Jewish leaders such as Rosa Luxemburg fed into the stereotype of the Jewish revolutionary. Thousands of demobilized veterans found in the Freikorps, paramilitary groups formed by former officers and soldiers, a community where they could channel their frustration. These groups fought against left-wing revolutionaries, presenting themselves as defenders of the true Germany against the Judeo-Bolshevik threat, and many of their members would later carry a culture of normalized violence and deep anti-Semitism into the ranks of the SA and SS. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919 reinforced the perception of betrayal. The harsh conditions imposed, territorial losses, economic reparations, reduction of the army, and the guilt clause were interpreted as a national humiliation. Again, nationalist propaganda blamed the November criminals and presented the treaty as the work of an international Jewish conspiracy. The fact that politicians of Jewish origin, such as Walter Rathenau, participated in diplomatic negotiations to soften the conditions was distorted, portraying them as traitors rather than patriots. The political instability of the early years of Weimar created an ideal breeding ground for radical movements. Between 1919 and 1923, Germany experienced left-wing revolutionary attempts, right-wing coups, political assassinations, and street confrontations. Violence became a regular method of doing politics, normalizing itself in public life. In this chaotic environment, dozens of Völkisch, racial nationalist groups emerged, combining anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and rejection of democracy. One of these groups was the German Workers' Party, DAP, founded in Munich in 1919. Hitler, then an army intelligence agent tasked with monitoring political groups, joined this small organization and quickly rose to become its main speaker. Under his influence, the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, in 1920, and adopted a 25-point program that included the revocation of the Treaty of Versailles, territorial expansion, and, crucially, the exclusion of Jews from German citizenship. The economic collapse of 1923, with hyperinflation that wiped out savings and wages, brought the crisis to a climax. In just a few months, the German mark lost all value. Millions were needed to buy a loaf of bread and billions to buy an egg. The middle class, the backbone of German society, was ruined. Many sought to blame someone, and the stereotypical figure of the Jewish speculator provided a convenient target. The anti-Semitic caricatures of the time showed fat Jewish bankers manipulating the economy while hungry Germans begged on the streets. In this context of despair, Nazi rhetoric found resonance. Hitler did not invent German anti-Semitism, nor was he its only promoter, but he demonstrated a unique ability to synthesize scattered prejudices into a coherent and emotionally powerful narrative. His rhetoric combined victimhood, promises of national redemption, and the identification of enemies with a theatricality that resonated with frustrated audiences. The attempted coup in November 1923, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, marks the end of this first phase. Although the coup failed and Hitler was imprisoned, the subsequent trial provided him with a national platform to spread his ideas. At the Landsberg fortress, during the 9 months of his imprisonment, he dictated to Rudolf Hess the first part of Mein Kampf, where he would systematize his worldview and elevate anti-Semitism to the organizing principle of his political program. The years 1918 to 1923 transformed German anti-Semitism. What had once been a social prejudice or a political stance, among others, became a totalizing narrative that explained the defeat, inflation, instability, and moral crisis. Hitler did not create this climate, but he was the one who best interpreted it and offered the most radical solution: racial purification as the response to all of Germany's problems. From fanatic to Führer, hate turned into absolute power. The period that began with Hitler's release from Landsberg prison in December 1924 marks the transition of anti-Semitism from a marginal current to the official doctrine of the state. This process was neither linear nor instantaneous, but rather passed through various phases of expansion, consolidation, and radicalization, driven by both Hitler's personal ambition and the changing circumstances of the Weimar Republic. After the failure of the Munich Putsch, Hitler learned a fundamental lesson. He would not attempt to seize power by force again, but instead would use the legal mechanisms of the democratic system to destroy it from within. This strategy of legality involved participating in elections, building tactical alliances, and presenting an image of respectability that would attract conservative sectors without renouncing the ideological core of the movement. During these years, Hitler consolidated his absolute control over the party. The cult of his personality became institutionalized. His word became the indisputable law for the members of the NSDAP. Internal conflicts were resolved by appealing to the Führer's authority, a title that began to be used regularly to refer to him. This vertical structure reflected the Nazi conception of leadership, not as democratic representation, but as the mystical embodiment of the will of the people. The publication of Mein Kampf in 1925 to 1926 provided ideological coherence to the Nazi movement, crystallizing Hitler's worldview. In this work, anti-Semitism occupies a central place, presenting it not as irrational hate, but as a scientific and moral conclusion. The Jew appears as the ontological enemy of the Aryan race, embodying opposing values: materialism versus idealism, individualism versus community, disintegration versus creation. This ideological construction justified any measure against the Jews as an act of self-defense of civilization. The German economic recovery between 1924 and 1929, facilitated by the Dawes Plan and the influx of American capital, temporarily reduced the appeal of extremist messages. In the 1928 elections, the NSDAP received only 2.6% of the vote. However, even during this period of apparent stability, Hitler continued to build his organization. The party established a territorial structure, the Gau, a sophisticated propaganda apparatus, and branches for different social sectors. The key figure in this professionalization of propaganda was Joseph Goebbels, appointed Gauleiter regional leader of Berlin in 1926. A PhD in philosophy and a trained journalist, Goebbels understood that anti-Semitism would not be effective if presented as rational argumentation. It had to be translated into images, slogans, and rituals that emotionally connected with the masses. Under his leadership, Nazi propaganda simplified complex messages into absolute dualisms: Germans versus Jews, creation versus destruction, blood versus money. The party's publications, such as the newspaper Völkischer Beobachter and the magazine Der Stürmer, the latter edited by Julius Streicher, spread anti-Semitic caricatures where Jews were depicted with animal-like features associated with rats, parasites, or demons. This visual dehumanization paved the psychological ground for subsequent legal exclusion. The turning point came with the 1929 stock market crash and the ensuing Great Depression. The German economy, dependent on American credit, collapsed. Unemployment skyrocketed to 6 million people by 1932. The fragile stability of the previous years was revealed to be illusory, and large sectors of the population lost confidence in the democratic system and in traditional political parties. In this crisis context, the NSDAP experienced explosive growth. From the 12 seats gained in 1928, it rose to 107 in 1930 and 230 by July 1932, becoming the most voted party. This rise was not solely due to Nazi anti-Semitism. The promise of work, order, and national greatness attracted many desperate voters, but the Jew remained in Hitler's discourse as the ultimate cause of all Germany's ills. Hitler's strategy began to yield results when conservative sectors, industrialists, landowners, and the military saw in him a barrier against communism. Figures like Franz von Papen and Alfred Hugenberg, representatives of the traditional establishment, believed they could tame Hitler by integrating him into a coalition government where conservatives would retain real control. On January 30, 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor by Hindenburg. Although the Nazis only held 3 of the 11 ministries, he had gained legal access to state power with no intention of sharing it, as his conservative allies believed. The Reichstag fire on February 27th provided the pretext for the first major repressive measure, the Decree for the Protection of the People and the State, which suspended fundamental rights. The final consolidation came with the Enabling Act, March 23rd, which allowed the government to enact laws without parliamentary intervention. With the Communist Party banned, many social democratic deputies arrested, and nationalists supporting the measure, Hitler obtained dictatorial powers through formally legal means, marking the death of German democracy. While the main targets of this first wave of repression were political, many Jews linked to the left suffered arrests, torture, or internment in the first camps like Dachau. The following months were a process of Gleichschaltung, coordination. All areas of public life, press, universities, administration, culture, sports, were progressively Nazified. Trade unions were replaced by the German Labour Front, controlled by the party. Regional governments were subordinated to Berlin. Political opposition was eliminated, with all parties except the NSDAP banned by July. In this context of rapid Nazification, on April 1, 1933, the first official boycott was organized against Jewish businesses, doctors, and lawyers. Members of the SA stood in front of Jewish establishments with signs such as "Germans, defend yourselves, do not buy from Jews." Although the measure officially lasted only 1 day and was not universally respected, it marked a qualitative shift. Anti-Semitism was no longer just party propaganda, but state policy. A few days later, on April 7th, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was enacted, which allowed Jews and political opponents to be expelled from the administration. This was followed by measures to exclude Jews from professions such as law, medicine, and journalism. The legal process of marginalization had begun. Between 1923 and 1933, Hitler and Nazism underwent an extraordinary transformation. From a marginal movement to a dominant party, from an anti-system force to the ruler of the state. In this rise, anti-Semitism was not an opportunistic addition, but the ideological core that provided coherence to the entire program. The persecution of Jews was not for Hitler just one policy among others, but a necessary condition for the regeneration of Germany. By conquering the state, Hitler acquired the tools to turn that obsessive anti-Semitism into a systematic program of exclusion, expropriation, and eventually extermination. The German state machinery, with its efficient bureaucracy, legal apparatus, police, and military, was now at the service of a hatred that had germinated in the cafés of Imperial Vienna and matured in the trenches and beer halls of the post-war period. The law against a people, how persecution was legalized. Nazi anti-Semitism was not limited to incendiary rhetoric or sporadic acts of violence. Once in power, Hitler implemented a systematic process of exclusion backed by an increasingly restrictive legal framework. Between 1933 and 1935, the persecution of German Jews evolved from isolated measures of discrimination to a complete body of legislation that officially turned them into second-class citizens. The first coordinated action by the regime against Jews was the April 1, 1933 boycott. Members of the SA, in uniform and holding signs with anti-Semitic slogans, stood in front of Jewish stores, medical offices, and law firms, preventing clients and patients from entering. In some cities, store windows were marked with Star of David symbols or the word Jude painted in yellow. Although officially lasting only one day, the boycott had a profound psychological impact. It was the first time that the modern German state supported a widespread anti-Semitic action. On April 7th, just a week later, the first major anti-Semitic legislative measure was enacted, the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. This decree allowed for the expulsion of non-Aryan civil servants and political opponents from the administration. In practice, it resulted in the immediate dismissal of thousands of Jewish judges, prosecutors, university professors, teachers, and public employees. The law included an exception clause, Hindenburger Lassung, that protected World War I veterans, those who had lost family members in the conflict, or those who were already civil servants before 1914. This concession, demanded by President Hindenburg, reflected the initial contradictions in anti-Semitic policy. On the one hand, Jews were being expelled from public life. On the other, the patriotism of many was implicitly recognized. The expulsion of Jews from the civil service was only the first step. Throughout 1933 and 1934, a cascade of decrees and regulations further restricted their access to liberal professions and economic activities. On April 22, 1933, Jewish doctors were prohibited from working in public hospitals or treating patients covered by Social Security, which affected 90% of their potential patients. On April 25th, access for Jewish students to public educational institutions was limited through a restrictive quota system. In July, the naturalization of Jews from Eastern Europe was revoked, many of whom had been in Germany for decades. In October, the editor's law excluded Jews from journalism and publishing. During 1934, Jewish presence in theaters, cinemas, concerts, and exhibitions was limited, both among artists and the audience. These measures not only affected the livelihoods of the Jewish population, but they also began their exclusion from the German public and cultural space. The process was gradual but relentless. Each new restriction normalized discrimination and prepared the ground for the next. Alongside legal measures, an intense social pressure campaign developed. Posters appeared throughout Germany with slogans such as "Jews are not welcome," and numerous establishments began rejecting Jewish customers even without a legal ban. This informal segregation had a dual purpose: to intimidate the Jews and to habituate Aryans to seeing them as strangers. Harassment became systematic. Members of the Hitler Youth sang anti-Semitic songs in front of Jewish homes. Neighbors who bought from Jewish stores were photographed and publicly denounced, and Jewish professionals saw their names on local blacklists. School life was particularly cruel. Jewish children were forced to sit in Jewish benches, separate from others, excluded from activities and subjected to humiliations about their supposed racial characteristics, with many teachers actively fostering ostracism. Thousands of Jewish families ended up removing their children from state schools, inadvertently accelerating the segregation the regime sought. Despite this growing hostility, many German Jews still held hope that the situation would improve. The anti-Semitic measures did not follow a consistent pattern. Periods of intense persecution alternated with phases of relative calm. This ambiguity was partly calculated. The regime sought to avoid provoking overly negative international reactions and maintained the fiction of a rule of law state where persecution was channeled through formally legal norms. However, on September 15, 1935, during the Nazi Party's annual Congress in Nuremberg, Hitler announced 3 laws that removed any doubt about the direction of the regime. These Nuremberg laws institutionalized anti-Semitism as a fundamental principle of the German state and marked a point of no return in the racial segregation policy. The first, the Reich Citizenship Law, established a fundamental distinction between citizens and mere subjects. Only people of German or related blood could be full citizens with political rights. Jews were reduced to the status of subjects of the state, without effective political rights and at the mercy of legal arbitrariness. The second, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Germans, criminalizing what they called racial contamination. It also prohibited Jews from employing German women under the age of 45 in their homes, under the pretext of protecting them from racial seduction. This law transformed intimate relations into a state matter, introducing racial surveillance into the most private aspects of life. The third law, complemented by subsequent decrees, legally defined who was a Jew based on ancestral, not religious criteria. A person with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was classified as a full Jew, regardless of personal identification or religious affiliation. Those with 2 Jewish grandparents were considered Mischlinge, mixed race, of the first degree, and those with 1 Jewish grandparent of the second degree, with varying levels of restrictions depending on the case. Jewishness was conceived as an indelible hereditary stain, passed through blood and detectable through genealogy. The Nuremberg laws created an existential crisis for many Germans who until then had not primarily identified as Jews. Thousands discovered with horror that their ancestors' religious conversion, cultural integration, or patriotism did not protect them. The state had created a racial category from which it was impossible to escape. Paradoxically, these laws were received by some Jewish sectors with a certain temporary relief. After 2 years of unpredictable violence and arbitrary measures, the Nuremberg laws at least established a defined framework, however terrible it was. The illusion that the regime, having satisfied its most basic anti-Semitic impulses, would stop at this point led many to believe that the situation would not worsen. Time would prove how mistaken this hope was. The implementation of the Nuremberg laws required a vast bureaucratic apparatus. Thousands of officials were assigned to determine the racial category of citizens with dubious ancestry. Parish records, birth certificates, military files, and neighbors' denunciations were used to racially classify the population. Genealogy, once a hobby of aristocrats, became a matter of life or death. The most disturbing part of this process was its appearance of administrative normality. Racial exclusion was presented not as an act of barbarism, but as a routine procedure backed by science, law, and bureaucracy. This normalization of institutional racism was possibly the greatest ideological success of the regime, turning the monstrous into the everyday. By 1935, the Nazi state had built the legal foundations of an apartheid system. The German Jewish community, approximately 500,000 people before Hitler, was already legally marginalized, economically weakened, and socially isolated. They were trapped in a legal limbo, too German to be simply expelled, but excluded from the national community that many had considered their own for generations. The period from 1933 to 1935 reveals a consistent pattern in Nazi anti-Semitic policy. Each step prepared the next in a spiral of radicalization. What began with humiliating posters and boycotts evolved into complete legal segregation. This calculated progression had a double purpose. On one hand, to habituate the German population to the exclusion of their Jewish fellow citizens. On the other, to strip the victims of the material, legal, and psychological resources to resist what was coming. The Nuremberg laws were not the end of the persecution process, but the end of its initial phase. They had made anti-Semitism the cornerstone of the German legal order and laid the groundwork for even more radical measures. Legal exclusion prepared the ground for what would come next: mass expropriation, ghettos, deportations, and finally, extermination. But in 1935, this apocalyptic future was still unimaginable to most Germans, Jews or not, although all the seeds had already been planted. Wrapped by the world, why didn't the Jews escape? From our current perspective, knowing the final fate of European Jews under Nazism, it is bewildering that so many remained in Germany when it was still possible to leave. By 1938, of the approximately 500,000 Jews living in Germany when Hitler came to power, about 150,000 had emigrated. Why didn't the other 350,000 do the same? This seemingly simple question hides a complex reality where identity factors, practical obstacles, and crucially the abandonment by the international community intertwine. The deepest factor explaining why so many Jews stayed in Germany was their cultural and emotional attachment to the country. Many families had been living in German territory for centuries, had fought in German wars, and had contributed significantly to society. The Jewish emancipation of the 19th century had allowed their full participation in public life, and the idea of Jewish German was a lived reality, not a contradiction. This identification was evident in figures such as Heinrich Heine, Felix Mendelssohn, or Albert Einstein, who symbolized the synthesis between the German and Jewish identities. For them, German was their mother tongue, Goethe and Schiller, their literary references, Kantian philosophy, part of their education. Leaving Germany meant not only losing material possessions, but also renouncing a cultural identity built over generations. For many, especially the more assimilated, Judaism was primarily a religious or cultural heritage, not the central axis of their identity. They saw themselves as Germans of Mosaic faith, patriots whose loyalty to the country was beyond doubt. World War I had strengthened this feeling. 100,000 German Jews had fought in the Imperial Army, 12,000 had died in combat, and thousands had been decorated for their bravery. The testimony of philosopher Victor Klemperer, who remained in Germany until the end of the war, illustrates this identity paradox. I felt more German than Jewish. I never imagined that my country would turn me into an enemy. Even under Hitler, I still believed in the true Germany, the one of Lessing and Goethe, not that of the Nazis. This identification with Germany created cognitive dissonance. How could the nation of Kant, the homeland of humanism and the Enlightenment, uphold anti-Semitism? Many Jews clung to the belief that Nazism was a passing fever, a temporary aberration that the true German spirit would eventually reject. Hitler would be contained by the institutions, moderated by his conservative allies, or overthrown by the military. This hope, though understandable from the historical experience, would tragically prove to be wrong. Alongside these identity factors, there were formidable practical obstacles to emigration. The first was economic. Since 1933, the regime imposed increasingly severe restrictions on the transfer of capital abroad. Jews who decided to emigrate could only take a minimal fraction of their assets, leaving behind a lifetime of work. Many preferred to exhaust their possibilities in Germany rather than start over in a foreign country without resources and contacts. The regime cynically exploited this situation. On one hand, it pressured Jews to leave the country. On the other, it prevented them from taking their assets, turning each emigration into a de facto confiscation. The emigration tax, Reichsfluchtsteuer, initially designed to prevent capital flight during the economic crisis, became an extortion mechanism, forcing individuals to pay up to 90% of their wealth in order to obtain exit permits. The difficulties increased for the elderly or sick. How could a 60-year-old doctor, lawyer, or professor who had built their life in Germany start anew in a foreign country, unable to speak the language and unable to practice their profession? For many, emigration meant resigning to live on charity in an unknown land, a price too high even in the face of growing hostility. Family divisions complicated the decision even further. Often, receiving countries accepted young or skilled workers but rejected the elderly or those with health issues. This forced families to choose between separating or staying together to face an uncertain fate. Many chose to remain united, especially when they had vulnerable members who would not be accepted in other countries. The most decisive obstacle, however, was the restrictive immigration policy of the potential host countries. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, few countries were willing to accept Jewish refugees. The United States maintained a quota system that severely limited immigration from Eastern Europe, from where many German Jewish families came. Great Britain imposed similar restrictions and limited entry to Palestine, then under British mandate to avoid antagonizing the Arab population. France, already overwhelmed by refugees from the Spanish Civil War, progressively tightened its requirements. The Evian Conference, convened by US President Franklin D. Roosevelt in July 1938 to address the refugee crisis, revealed this global indifference. Representatives from 32 countries gathered in France to discuss the issue of Jews fleeing the Third Reich. The outcome was bleak. No nation except the Dominican Republic showed a willingness to significantly increase their immigration quotas. The excuses were many but converging: economic problems, fear of an increase in internal anti-Semitism, concerns about altering the national ethnic balance. The Australian delegation stated bluntly, "We do not have a Jewish problem, and we do not want to import one." The Swiss delegate said, "Switzerland cannot be considered a country of refuge. We already host too many foreigners." Canada limited itself to accepting some farmers, while Argentina, Brazil, and other Latin American countries imposed almost insurmountable bureaucratic obstacles. This international response sent a devastating message to the German Jews: no one wanted them. Anti-Semitism was not exclusive to Germany. It was also present in the restrictive immigration policies of supposedly liberal democracies. Nazi propaganda cynically exploited this rejection. "See? Not even the democracies want them. At least we are honest about it." A partial exception to this indifference was the Havara Agreement transfer, signed in 1933 between the Nazi authorities and Zionist representatives. This controversial pact allowed German Jews to emigrate to Palestine by transferring part of their capital through the purchase of German products, which would be exported and sold there. Approximately 60,000 Jews used this route before the war closed it. However, Palestine was not a viable option for everyone. British authorities severely limited Jewish immigration, many lacked the necessary resources, and others did not identify with the Zionist project. As the anti-Semitic policy radicalized, the wave of emigration increased. After the annexation of Austria in March 1938 and the violence unleashed against the Viennese Jews, a massive exodus took place. The Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, in November 1938, with its synagogue set on fire, stores looted, and 30,000 Jews sent to concentration camps, eliminated any doubt about the future under Nazism. By then, however, escape routes were quickly closing. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, emigration became almost impossible. Borders closed, visas were further restricted, and German submarines made maritime transit extremely dangerous. The Jews who had not fled were trapped in a Europe that would soon be dominated by those who had sworn to exterminate them. The question, "Why didn't they flee?" reveals more about our historical misunderstanding than about the real options available to the German Jews in the 1930s. It was not due to blindness, naive optimism, or irrational attachment to Germany. It was because they loved their country, because they could not foresee an unprecedented horror, because emigrating meant total uprooting, and above all because the world closed its doors to them when they needed them open the most. The tragedy of the Holocaust was not only the work of the direct perpetrators, but also of the passive spectators who, being able to help, chose not to. As Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel wrote, "What hurts me is not the cruelty of the enemies, but the silence of the friends." The Black Order, Himmler, Eichmann, and the bureaucracy of extermination. Between 1936 and 1939, while the world watched with apprehension the German rearmament and Hitler's territorial ambitions, within the Reich, a parallel power structure was consolidating, less visible but equally threatening. The SS, Schutzstaffel, under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, was transforming from an elite personal guard into a state within a state, with its own ideology, bureaucracy, and repressive apparatus. This organization, imbued with a quasi-religious racial fanaticism, would become the executing instrument of the final solution. The rise of the SS as a fundamental pillar of the Third Reich formally began on June 17, 1936, when Hitler appointed Himmler as chief of the German police. This seemingly administrative appointment had revolutionary consequences. For the first time in modern history, all police forces in a country, Gestapo, secret police, Kripo, criminal police, and Orpo, uniformed police, were subordinated not to the Ministry of the Interior, but to a party organization. The distinction between state and party, already blurred in other areas, completely disappeared in matters of security. Himmler, a former chicken breeder with a nondescript appearance and soft voice, was in fact one of the most radical ideologues of Nazism. Obsessed with racial purity, Germanic runes, and pseudoscientific theories about Aryan superiority, he conceived the SS not just as a security force, but as the seed of a new racial aristocracy that would dominate Europe after the final victory. Under his direction, the SS became a pseudo-religious order with its own rituals, symbols, and moral code. To join, candidates had to demonstrate racial purity up to 1750, pass rigorous physical tests, and swear absolute loyalty to Hitler. The organization's motto, "My honor is called loyalty," reflected its fundamental ethic: blind obedience to superior orders regardless of traditional moral considerations. This combination of ideological fanaticism and military structure allowed the SS to execute the regime's most extreme policies without ethical questioning. As Rudolf Höss, commander of Auschwitz, would later declare, "In the SS we were taught that orders had to be obeyed without discussion. It was not our task to reflect, while others took responsibility." Along with the consolidation of the police forces, Himmler developed the ideological dimension of the SS through institutions such as the Office for Race and Settlement, Russia, which was responsible for supervising the racial purity of the members and their families. The Lebensborn program, established in 1935 but significantly expanded during these years, promoted reproduction among SS members and racially valuable women, even going so far as to establish special homes for single mothers of Aryan origin. At the same time, scientific research on race intensified. The Ahnenerbe, Society for the Research and Teaching of German Ancestral Heritage, funded archaeological expeditions, anthropological studies, and medical experiments to prove Aryan superiority and the inferiority of other races, especially Jews and Slavs. What started as folkloric pseudoscience would evolve during the war into atrocious experiments on prisoners of concentration camps. The Nazi security apparatus was perfected with the creation of the SD, Sicherheitsdienst, under the direction of Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's protégé, and considered the intellectual architect of the Holocaust. Nicknamed the Blonde Beast, Heydrich combined brilliant analytical intelligence with a complete lack of empathy. Under his command, the SD developed a meticulous surveillance system with thousands of informants reporting on political attitudes, anti-regime jokes, and especially anything related to the Jewish question. Within this structure, Adolf Eichmann stood out, a middle-class man who found his calling in bureaucratic anti-Semitism. Initially a simple officer tasked with investigating Zionism, he became the Nazi expert on forced Jewish emigration, a euphemism for what was a systematic process of dispossession and expulsion. In a few months, this bureaucratic system had forced the departure of tens of thousands of Austrian Jews. What Eichmann had built was not just an expulsion mechanism, but a model for the mass processing of human beings that would later be used for deportations to extermination camps. As he would later state at his trial in Jerusalem, it was like a conveyor belt. At one end, a Jew with property, factory, store, and bank account was placed, and at the other end, he came out with nothing. The success of this model led to its implementation in Berlin and other German cities. By 1939, the National Center for Jewish Emigration, run by the SS, had completely systematized the expulsion process, creating bureaucratic and logistical precedents that would later be adapted for mass deportation once the war began. Alongside the development of this administrative machinery, the system of concentration camps expanded. While in 1933 there were makeshift facilities to detain political opponents, by 1939, a network of permanent camps had been established, managed by the Concentration Camp Inspection, IKL, another branch of the SS. Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Mauthausen. Each of these names represents a link in a chain of institutionalized terror. Although the number of Jews interned in these camps before the war was relatively small, most prisoners were political opponents, criminals, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and other marginalized groups. The system had already perfected methods of systematic dehumanization, striped uniforms, shaved heads, numbers instead of names, arbitrary punishments, slave labor, and the elimination of any trace of individuality. The night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, marked a turning point. What was presented as a spontaneous expression of popular fury after the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a Polish Jew was in reality a coordinated operation by the SS and the Gestapo. Hundreds of synagogues were set on fire, thousands of Jewish businesses were looted, and approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Kristallnacht revealed the growing radicalization of anti-Semitic policy. Until then, the regime had maintained a certain appearance of legality, but now it openly resorted to physical violence. More importantly, it was the first time that the mass internment of Jews in camps was used as a tool of terror and control. Although most were released in the following weeks, they had experienced the methods of the SS: systematic humiliation, arbitrary violence, total dehumanization. After Kristallnacht, control of the Jewish question passed definitively into the hands of the SS. Hermann Göring, nominally in charge of economic policy, issued a decree imposing a collective fine of 1 billion marks on the German Jewish community and transferred responsibility for anti-Jewish measures to Himmler and Heydrich. Persecution was no longer a matter of propaganda or legislation, but became an issue of state security, managed by experts in organized violence. The final step in the construction of the persecution's bureaucratic apparatus came on September 27, 1939, shortly after the outbreak of the war. On that day, the Reich Central Security Office, RSHA, was established, uniting all security services, SD, Gestapo, and Kripo, under a single command. Reinhard Heydrich, now with practically unlimited powers in matters of internal and external security, was placed at the helm. Within the RSHA, Section 4B4, led by Adolf Eichmann, was specifically in charge of Jewish affairs. What had started as a small department within the SD now became the nerve center of anti-Semitic policy, with ramifications in all occupied or allied territories of the Reich. The Jewish question was no longer a political or social issue, it was a matter of state security that required radical solutions. By 1939, the machinery for extermination was ready. The SS had built a parallel power structure where Himmler's leadership provided ideological direction, Heydrich's intelligence contributed strategic planning, and Eichmann's efficiency ensured practical implementation. All that was missing was the catalytic factor, the war, which would provide both the opportunity and the cover for the final solution. The persecution of the Jews was not a burst of fanaticism or a tactical improvisation, but a systematic process supported by a modern and efficient state machinery. The first attempt of genocide, Poland before the Holocaust. In the early morning of September 1, 1939, when the first German shots hit Westerplatte, not only did World War II begin, but also a new and brutal stage in the Nazi persecution of the Jews. The invasion of Poland, more than a military campaign, was an ideological and racial war. Hitler had made it clear days earlier, the goal was not simply to defeat Poland, but to annihilate its population. The phrase he spoke then would resonate for years. Who today remembers the extermination of the Armenians? The war provided the ideal context to radicalize anti-Semitic policy. Poland, with more than 3 million Jews, became a large-scale laboratory for applying the regime's racial theories. Unlike the gradual process in Germany, in Poland the violence was immediate. SS units known as Einsatzgruppen accompanied the regular army with the mission of murdering political leaders, intellectuals, and above all the Jews. In just a few months, tens of thousands were executed in mass shootings in fields, forests, and cemeteries. The victims were identified using pre-existing lists, arrested, taken to remote locations and murdered, often after digging their own graves. Meanwhile, the country was being divided. The western regions were annexed to the Reich. The rest formed the so-called general government. In both areas, anti-Jewish policies were intensified. In October 1939, Reinhard Heydrich ordered the concentration of Jews in cities with train stations, the creation of Judenräte, Jewish councils, and the registration of all Jewish property. The goal was clear: to organize, control, and prepare for future elimination. Soon after, ghettos began to form. The most notorious, that of Warsaw, came to house over 400,000 people in just 3.4 square kilometers. Other ghettos were established in Łódź, Krakow, Lwów, and Lublin. These spaces were authentic prisons: walls, barbed wire, hunger, disease, and death. The food rations allocated did not exceed 800 calories per day. The conditions were deliberately lethal. In Warsaw alone, more than 83,000 people died from hunger or epidemics before 1942. In the short term, the ghettos allowed isolation and control. In the medium term, they generated mass mortality that many Nazis considered natural, and in the long term, they served as transit stations to destinations still being planned. At the same time, territorial solutions were being evaluated. First came the failed plan to create a Jewish reserve in Lublin, then the so-called Madagascar Plan, which aimed to deport millions of Jews to the French colony. However, the failure to defeat the United Kingdom made it unfeasible. These attempts, far from slowing the extermination drive, only radicalized it further. In October 1940, Hitler delivered his prophecy before the Reichstag. If the Jews brought the world to war, the result would be their extermination. By that time, that prophecy was already being fulfilled. Although he avoided leaving written records, Hitler approved each major step: the creation of ghettos, deportations, and mass executions. His subordinates worked towards the Führer, executing his wishes without waiting for detailed orders. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 brought the persecution to its bloodiest phase. Operation Barbarossa was conceived as a war of annihilation against Judeo-Bolshevism. The Einsatzgruppen, now reinforced with police battalions and local collaborators, not only executed leaders but also exterminated entire communities. In 6 months, they murdered more than 500,000 people, often in public massacres such as Babi Yar, where nearly 34,000 Jews were executed over 2 days. These methods, however, posed problems. They were slow, costly, and psychologically draining for the perpetrators. By the end of 1941, experiments began with more efficient methods. In Chelmno, gas trucks were used for the first time. Victims were asphyxiated with carbon monoxide during the journey to the forest. It was the first step towards industrialized extermination. Between the invasion of Poland and early 1942, Nazism completed its evolution from legal exclusion to systematic murder. First came segregation, ghettos, then mass shootings, and finally experiments with gas. Each stage prepared the next. Nothing was accidental. This process was made possible by a lethal combination: racial ideology, efficient bureaucracy, modern technology, and a war that legitimized extreme violence. At the center of it all, Hitler maintained his role as the silent architect of genocide. Poland, in this sense, was the epicenter of the general rehearsal for the Holocaust. There, all elements of genocide were tested, from registration and deportation to forced labor, planned hunger, mass executions, and the industrialization of death. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 was not the beginning, but the formalization. What was decided there had been practiced for 2 years in the ghettos, pits, and roads of occupied Poland. It was there that persecution was definitively transformed into annihilation. Extermination became state policy, and the world, still trapped in its conventional war, did not know, or did not want to know, that another, much quieter and more monstrous war had already begun.